32 years. 32 years I'd waited for this. For us. Sarah, my wife, my everything, and I had finally closed on the house. Our house. A quaint two-story in a quiet suburb, the kind where kids played in the streets and the only sounds at night were crickets and the distant hum of traffic. It was perfect. After a year of marriage, crammed into my tiny apartment, this felt like a fresh start. A place to build, to grow, to finally breathe. The first few weeks were bliss. Boxes unpacked, furniture arranged, walls painted in the soft blue Sarah had always dreamed of. Evenings were spent on the back patio, a small oasis of calm after the chaos of the city, sipping wine, watching the sunset, whispering about the future. Children! A dog! All of it within reach. Then the bomb dropped. They bought the house next door, Sarah said, her voice strangely flat. I laughed, a short, disbelieving bark. What? Who bought what? Mom and Dad? The Petersons. They bought the house next door to us. The laughter died in my throat. You're joking, right? There's no way. But I saw the flicker of something in her eyes, a nervous twitch, and I knew she wasn't joking. Before I could even process the words, a fleet of moving trucks lumbered down the street, grinding to a halt in front of the house next to ours. And there they were, Mark and Linda Peterson, my in-laws, waving like they'd just won the lottery. It's a coincidence, Sarah insisted, her voice laced with a desperate hope. They've been talking about downsizing for ages. This house just happened to be available. Coincidence? My gut twisted. No! This was no goddamn coincidence. Linda's smile was too wide. Mark's eyes held too much triumphant glee. They'd planned this. I knew it. And Sarah, sweet, naive Sarah, was trying to convince herself it was all perfectly normal. They won't be intrusive, she promised, squeezing my hand. They're just excited to be nearby. I wanted to believe her. God, I wanted to believe her. But a dark, icy premonition settled in my stomach. This wasn't going to be simple. This wasn't going to be okay. This was the beginning of something terrible. My fears were confirmed within the first week. It started small, insidious. A creeping tendril of control disguised as helpfulness. I came home from work one evening, exhausted after a brutal day of negotiations, and found Linda already inside our house. Just helping Sarah out, sweetie, she chirped, fluffing pillows on the couch. She's at the store. Thought I'd tidy up a bit. I stared at her, dumbfounded. How did you get in? She smiled, a saccharine sweetness that sent shivers down my spine. Oh, Sarah gave me a spare key when you guys first moved in, just in case of emergencies. Emergencies? Rearranging throw pillows wasn't an emergency. This was a violation, a flagrant disregard for our boundaries or lack thereof. I'm sure Sarah would have mentioned it, honey, she said, noticing my scowl. But she gets so busy. The next day it was Mark. I found him in my backyard, mowing the lawn. My lawn. Without asking, just lending a hand, he boomed, waving cheerfully. Didn't want you to have to bother with it after a long day at work. I clenched my fists, fighting the urge to yell. I appreciate it, Mark, but I can handle it myself. He shrugged, a casual dismissal. No problem. Just trying to be neighborly. But as he walked back to his own yard, I noticed he'd left a couple of his tools in my shed, like it was some shared space now. Like he had a right to be there. The audacity, the blatant, entitled audacity. By the end of the week, it was a full-blown invasion. Linda started showing up every morning, letting herself in with her key. Sometimes she brought food, stale cookies or casseroles that tasted vaguely of regret. Sometimes she just tidied up, straightening picture frames, rearranging books, subtly marking her territory. But I saw her. The way she lingered over our mail, the way she casually asked about bills or packages we'd received. She was snooping, intruding on every aspect of our lives. And Sarah? Sarah didn't see the problem. They're just being helpful, she'd say. her voice laced with a note of weary tolerance. That's just how they are. How they are, I exploded one evening, after Linda had spent an hour critiquing our choice of curtains. They're taking over our lives. This is our house, Sarah, not a goddamn open house for the Petersons. She flinched, her eyes clouding with hurt. Don't yell at me. I don't want to hurt their feelings. Hurt their feelings? What about my feelings? What about our privacy? What about the future we were supposed to be building together, not suffocating under the weight of her parents' suffocating control? Evenings were worse. Every single night, like clockwork, Linda called, inviting us over for dinner, or just dropping by with something she'd baked. Saying no wasn't an option. If we declined, she'd act wounded, saying she never got to see Sarah anymore, despite the fact that she was in our house every single day. And it wasn't just the visits. Linda had opinions about everything. Our decor, our furniture, even our choice of paint color. She constantly suggested improvements, making comments about how the living room would look better with a softer color, or how our guest room should be turned into a proper family space, implying, of course, that it wasn't a family space now, because we didn't have children. One day, I caught her in our bedroom looking through Sarah's closet. Just checking if Sarah needed anything new for the season, she said, smiling brightly. That was it. Something inside me snapped. You can't just wander into our home and go through our things, I roared, my voice echoing through the house. She acted completely taken aback, like I was the one overreacting. I was just trying to be helpful, she protested, her voice trembling. Helpful? Or controlling? Mark wasn't much better. He treated our backyard like an extension of his own, even suggesting we install a gate between the two houses to make visits easier. Families shouldn't have boundaries, he chuckled, slapping me on the back. I shut that idea down immediately, but he just laughed it off, dismissing my concerns as trivial. One evening, I looked out the window and noticed something unsettling. Linda was watching our house, just standing by her window staring through the blinds. I brushed it off at first, but then it kept happening. Every time we left, every time we came home, she was there, watching. Her eyes, like predatory birds, fixed on us. The feeling of being watched, of being scrutinized, was suffocating. Things escalated when I finally told Sarah we needed to take back the spare key. I don't know, she said, her face etched with worry. I don't want to upset them. Upset them? I exploded. Sarah, they're treating our house like it's their own. We need boundaries, or this will never stop. She hesitated, clearly uncomfortable with the idea, but she finally agreed. Reluctantly. That evening, she brought it up while we were having dinner next door. The moment the words left her mouth, Linda's entire demeanor changed. She clutched her chest like she'd been personally attacked. I never thought I'd feel so unwelcome in my own daughter's home, she said, her voice trembling. Mark, sitting across from me, didn't say anything at first. He just stared at his plate, his jaw tightening. I could feel his anger radiating across the table. Sarah tried to smooth things over, saying it wasn't about shutting them out, just about privacy. Linda dabbed at her eyes with a napkin, then placed the key on the table with a sigh, like she was giving up something precious. She didn't look at me once. The next morning, I stepped outside and immediately noticed something off. The side fence, which had always been slightly uneven, was now perfectly straight. Fresh nails, new wood, like someone had fixed it overnight. I walked over and found Mark in our backyard, hammering in the last board. He barely glanced at me before saying, "Figured it was bothering you, so I took care of it." "I never asked you to do that," I said, my voice tight. He shrugged, wiped his hands, and said, "Just trying to help." Then he walked off, like it was nothing. Like he had a right to be in my backyard fixing my fence, without my permission. That same evening, Sarah got a call. Her parents wanted us over for dinner. I shook my head before she even finished the sentence. We had plans. But then she said Linda told her she had big news to share. Something important. So we went. The moment we sat down, Linda lit up like it was Christmas morning. She pulled out a folder of wallpaper samples and paint swatches, spreading them across the table. "I've picked out the cutest new look for your living room," she announced, beaming. "And I've already bought everything. I was planning to start redecorating over the weekend." I felt the snap before I even heard my own voice. "We're not redecorating anything," I said, my voice flat and cold. "Silence." Linda blinked at me, then her eyes welled up with tears. Her lower lip trembled. Mark put his fork down so hard it clattered against the plate. He leaned back in his chair and said, "You're being disrespectful." Linda only wanted to do something nice for her daughter. Sarah was frozen in place, looking back and forth between us. I could already tell she was trying to figure out how to keep the peace. She muttered something about how it was sweet of her mom, but that she wished they had asked first. Linda sniffled and said she just wanted to make our home feel warmer, more inviting, like a real family home. I was done. I stood up, grabbed my jacket, and told Sarah we were leaving. The next morning, Linda called Sarah, her voice weak and frail. She'd had a dizzy spell in the night. The stress from last night had been too much for her. She thought she was going to faint. Sarah panicked. She wanted to check on her. "It's manipulation," I said, my voice hard. She got defensive, saying her mom wouldn't fake something like that. But when she called her dad, Mark answered and said Linda was resting and trying to recover from the shock of last night. No mention of doctors, no mention of an actual medical issue. "We need real boundaries," I said. "If we don't set them now, this is going to spiral." She nodded, but looked guilty, like she was betraying someone. That night, I changed the locks. I didn't tell her beforehand. I knew she'd hesitate, maybe even try to talk me out of it. So I went to the hardware store, bought a new set, and installed them myself while she was out running errands. I was just finishing when I heard a voice behind me. Linda was standing on our porch, staring at the lock in my hand. Her face was unreadable at first, then slowly twisted into hurt and betrayal. She didn't yell. She just asked, "Why? Why didn't you tell us? Why didn't you at least let us know before doing something like this?" Mark wasn't far behind, stepping up beside her with crossed arms. He didn't look surprised. He looked angry. He told Sarah later that night that I was controlling her, that I was trying to isolate her from her family, that I was making her choose between them and me. Sarah was quiet after the call. I could tell she was struggling, torn between standing by me and the guilt her parents were drowning her in. After a long silence, she finally admitted she felt stuck in the middle. She didn't want to choose sides. A few days later, I found out from a neighbor that Linda had been asking questions about our schedule. When we left for work, when we got home, whether we had any trips planned. The calls to Sarah increased. Random ones throughout the day, checking in, making small talk, then slipping in comments about how she hoped Sarah wasn't feeling pressured, that she hoped she wasn't unhappy. Sarah brushed it off, but I could see the cracks forming. This wasn't over. Not even close. They were digging in, tightening their grip, and I knew I had to fight back, harder than ever before. The silence didn't last long. After the spare key showdown, Mark and Linda stopped coming over. No unannounced visits, no sudden appearances in the backyard. Nothing. For a few days, it was quiet. Too quiet. But then Sarah's phone started buzzing. At first, it was just casual check-ins. Linda sent morning texts asking how she was feeling. Then came the "just thinking of you" messages, followed by the "I hope you're okay" guilt trips. By the second day, Linda had shifted to reminiscing about when Sarah was younger, how close they used to be and how much she missed her. By the end of the week, it escalated. Linda showed up at our door holding a tin of homemade cookies, smiling like nothing had happened. She didn't acknowledge the past week's tension. Instead, she said she had been thinking and she wanted to put things behind us. She forgave me for overreacting. Then she reached into her purse and handed me a key. A brand new spare she had another one made. I didn't take it. Without saying a word, I shut the door. Less than an hour later, Sarah's phone went off. It was a message from Mark, A short, clipped sentence about how I was being petty and immature. Sarah stared at the screen for a while, but didn't reply. That evening, I came home to find Mark in our backyard. He wasn't just standing there. He was digging a full-blown trench, cutting through the grass along the side of the house. There were piles of dirt everywhere, a shovel resting against the fence. I stormed over, demanding to know what he was doing. Mark barely looked up, muttering that he was fixing our drainage. He claimed he had noticed some pooling water near our foundation and figured he'd take care of it. I told him to leave. Now. He stared at me for a second, then wiped his hands and slowly walked back toward his house like he wasn't in the wrong. No apology, no explanation, just walked off. That night, I told Sarah exactly what happened. She listened quietly, then finally admitted that maybe, just maybe, her parents were overstepping. Then, just as quickly, she tried to excuse it. They meant well. They didn't realize they were being intrusive. The next morning, Linda called. She had an idea. Since we were all family and now living so close, wouldn't it be great if we set up a family calendar? That way, they'd know when we were free for dinner, when we had plans, and when we'd be home. It would make things so much easier for everyone. I told her absolutely not. That was the final push for Sarah. She called her parents that night and told them, as gently as she could, that we needed space. Linda cried. The very next day, she called Sarah again. This time with an emergency. She had fallen. Sarah panicked, grabbed her keys, and rushed out the door. When she got there, Linda was perfectly fine. No ice packs, no bandages, just sitting on the couch with a cup of tea, watching TV. She looked surprised to see Sarah so worried. She waved it off, saying she had felt a little dizzy and thought she might have hit her head, but was probably okay now. Sarah barely spoke the rest of the night. That weekend, we planned a quiet night at home. No visits, no calls, just us. Right as we sat down to eat, the music started. Loud music. We stepped outside to see Mark and Linda sitting on their front porch with a few guests, wine glasses in hand, chatting loudly over the sound of old country music blasting from a portable speaker. It wasn't just a small gathering. It was deliberate. Every time we tried to ignore it, the laughter got louder. Linda made sure to glance our way every few minutes, a smug look on her face. It happened again the next weekend, and the one after that. The message was clear. They weren't backing down. I finally had enough. I walked over and told them straight up their constant interference was damaging my marriage. They looked offended, shocked even. Linda touched her chest like I had wounded her. Mark shook his head and muttered something about family looking out for each other. Sarah was standing beside me, nervous but determined. She told them we needed boundaries. Her voice was soft, unsure, but the words were there. Linda's expression darkened. She stared at Sarah for a long moment before finally whispering, "Is this really the life you want?" Then she looked at me. I could see it in her face. She still thought she could win. She was wrong. This wasn't just about annoying in-laws anymore. This was war. I began installing hidden security cameras. It felt intrusive, but it was the only way I could prove the harassment. Document everything. Their faces when they realized it was on camera was glorious. The front yard was completely different. It happened overnight. The grass had been replaced. New flower beds lined the walkway, and a fresh layer of mulch covered the garden. A neatly trimmed hedge had appeared along the driveway. I stood on the porch, staring at it in disbelief. Mark and Linda were already outside, smiling proudly. They had hired landscapers without asking. Linda beamed, clapping her hands together as she admired their gift. She said the house needed some curb appeal, and since they knew we'd never get around to it, they took care of it for us. I told them they had no right to make changes to our property. Mark's smile dropped instantly. His posture stiffened and his voice sharpened. He said they were just trying to help and couldn't understand why I was always so ungrateful. Sarah stood beside me, shifting awkwardly. She muttered that while it was wrong of them to do it without asking, They did pay for it. Maybe we could just leave it alone. I walked away before I said something I'd regret. That day, a neighbor pulled me aside. He had been at the last HOA meeting. Mark was there, not just as a homeowner. He was speaking on our behalf. He had been attending for weeks, suggesting new rules that would apply to our property. He tried to push through a policy about fence heights, backyard storage limits, and aesthetic consistency between neighboring houses, all things that just happened to affect us. I stormed back home and told Sarah. She barely reacted, just sat there staring at the floor. Then Linda texted her. She had a new idea. Since they all lived so close, wouldn't it be great if we installed a gate between our backyards? That way, there would be easy access for visits. No need to walk all the way around. I shut it down immediately. The next day, I caught Mark inside our house. I had come home early. The door was unlocked. I walked in and found him in our kitchen, casually looking through a drawer. He didn't even flinch. He smirked and pulled a key out of his pocket. He had another spare. Before I changed the locks, he had a copy made. That was it. I lost it. I told him this was insane. He had no right to just walk into our house. Linda came running over the second she heard the yelling. She took one look at the scene and immediately started crying. She clutched her chest, shaking her head, whispering about how cruel I was, how paranoid. Sarah just watched, frozen. Something in her finally clicked. She told them, her voice shaky but firm, that this wasn't normal, that they needed to stop. Linda gasped like she had been slapped. An hour later, the family group chat exploded. Linda sent out a long, dramatic message about how Sarah was being isolated and how I was controlling her, that I was forcing her to cut off her own parents and turning her into someone they didn't even recognize anymore. It spread fast. Sarah's aunts and uncles started chiming in. Some defended her. Others questioned if she was really happy in her marriage. Then Sarah's brother messaged me privately. He lived in another state and wasn't around much, but he had seen this kind of behavior before. He told me I was 100% right to push back, that their parents had always been overbearing, but no one ever called them out. I showed Sarah the message. She didn't say anything for a while. Then she sighed and said she wanted to go low contact. For the first time, I thought we had finally made progress. Then the next evening, Mark and Linda showed up. Linda forced a tight smile, and Mark stood stiffly beside her. "We want to fix things," she said, her voice carefully measured. "We'll respect your space from now on." Sarah nodded but said nothing. She had heard this before. This time, she didn't accept their words at face value. Instead of relief, there was only exhaustion in her expression, as if she already knew the cycle was repeating. The next day, I overheard them on the phone. Linda was laughing, telling someone, "We just need to wait him out. Sarah will come around." They weren't sorry. They were waiting. That was when I told Sarah we needed a real plan. This wasn't just about ignoring them. We needed cameras. We needed legal protections. We needed to figure out if we were staying or if we had to move. Sarah looked exhausted, but she nodded. She admitted she couldn't live like this forever. That night, I installed more security cameras. The next morning, Mark and Linda noticed. They stood in their driveway, staring up at the small black devices mounted over our front and back doors. By the next morning, the rumors had already started. A neighbor casually mentioned to me that Mark had been talking about how controlling I was. According to him, I was isolating Sarah, cutting her off from her family, and making it so no one could visit. Another neighbor stopped me while I was walking to my car and asked if everything was okay at home. She had heard that Sarah's parents were deeply worried about her well-being. It spread fast. Sarah wasn't religious, but her parents were heavily involved in their church. A few days later, she got a call from the pastor. He said he was concerned because Mark and Linda had come to him for guidance. They were struggling because their daughter was drifting away and might be in a troubled marriage. Sarah snapped. For weeks, she had hesitated. She had been torn, trying to balance her parents' emotions with the reality of their behavior, but something about that call set her off. She drove straight to their house and confronted them. Neighbors saw it happen. They saw Linda burst into tears on the porch, wailing that Sarah was brainwashed, that she was not the daughter she raised. Sarah left without another word. Later that night, I found out Linda had been posting on Facebook. Nothing direct, just vague, passive-aggressive posts about how some people change for the worse after marriage, how certain spouses try to steal loved ones away. She never mentioned our names, but it was obvious who she was talking about. Then, a few days later, the police showed up. A wellness check. They had received a call saying Sarah might be in danger, that she was being kept from her family and wasn't allowed to communicate freely. The officers were polite but clearly uncomfortable when Sarah opened the door and immediately reassured them. She was fine, that she was safe, that this was nothing more than manipulation. The cops left without issue. I was furious. That was the final push. Sarah and I decided we needed real distance. No more half measures. We blocked their numbers. No more texts, no more calls, no more sudden visits. Mark's response? He started weaponizing the HOA. Within days, we got our first complaint notice. It was about our trash bins. Apparently, they were an inch too close to the sidewalk. Then came a noise complaint. A fabricated one. Then another notice, this time about the unsightly placement of our lawn furniture. It was obvious who was behind it. I went straight to Mark. I told him, calmly but firmly, that if he continued harassing us, I would be speaking to a lawyer about a restraining order. For the first time, Mark didn't have a smug response. He just stared at me, jaw clenched. Then they went silent. No calls, no texts, no sudden appearances. 2 whole weeks of absolute peace. Then, one morning, an envelope showed up in our mailbox. A letter from Linda. It was long, full of apologies, of excuses, of manipulative pleas. She said she missed her daughter and wanted to fix things. She wanted us to come over for a family meeting to talk it out. Then, near the end of the letter came the hidden threat. She wrote, "I really hope we can work this out, but if we can't, I'll have to figure out another way to make things right." I knew exactly what that meant. This wasn't over. I consulted a lawyer. I started documenting everything. If they really wanted to escalate, I was going to be ready. The call came early in the morning. Mark had a heart scare. Sarah's phone lit up with frantic messages from Linda saying Mark wasn't feeling well. His chest was tight, and he was lightheaded. She was terrified. She didn't know what to do. Sarah hesitated before grabbing her keys. Something didn't feel right. When she arrived, she found Mark sitting upright on the couch, a cup of tea in his hands. Linda hovered nearby, eyes darting towards Sarah expectantly. No ambulance, no sign of distress. Sarah's stomach sank. It was the same pattern again. The fake emergencies, the guilt trips, the manipulation. She couldn't do this anymore, not even for her parents. She sat down in the chair, Linda standing at her side, and for once, Sarah was quiet. Then she spoke. It wasn't loud, it wasn't angry, but it was final. She told them she was done. Linda's mouth fell open. She blinked like she hadn't heard correctly. Mark sat up a little, narrowed his eyes, then Sarah stood. She said she saw exactly what they were doing, every guilt trip, every fake emergency, every manipulative stunt, and she wasn't falling for it anymore. Linda gasped. She wasn't prepared for this. Her voice got high and shaky, and she turned to her last weapon. She told Sarah that if she didn't fix this, if she didn't bring Op to apologize, then they would have no choice but to sell their house and move away forever. Sarah stood there for a second. Then she shrugged. Linda froze. For the first time, she realized it wasn't working. Sarah wasn't begging them to stay. She wasn't backtracking. She wasn't falling apart. Mark leaned forward, his voice low and measured. "Sarah, we need to fix this. You don't just walk away from family." His tone wasn't a plea, it was an expectation. He had spent years making demands in subtle ways, controlling situations without ever raising his voice. But this time, Sarah wasn't nodding along. She was listening, but she wasn't agreeing. Sarah hesitated for a long moment, her fingers tightening around the car keys. She spent months wavering, pulled between obligation and exhaustion. Finally, she exhaled, her voice quiet but firm. "I can't keep doing this," she said. "Every time we give you another chance, you push further. I love you, but this isn't healthy." Her words weren't instant or easy, but they were final. Linda screamed a raw, heartbroken, animalistic wail. She collapsed onto the couch, sobbing into her hands, shaking her head over and over. That Sarah was abandoning her, throwing away her family after everything they had done for her. Mark clenched his jaw. He stood trying to intimidate Sarah, then he turned to me. He stepped closer, his voice low. "You'll regret this," I laughed. Sarah turned, walked out the door, and I followed. The drive home was silent. Then Sarah let out a breath and muttered that it actually felt good. A for sale sign went up in their yard. I stood at the window, watching a real estate agent hammer it into the ground. Sarah saw it too. She didn't react at first, just stared. I didn't celebrate, not yet. It could have been another stunt. But then, a week later, the online listing appeared. Professional photos, a full description. They were serious. Then came the letter, Linda's final words. A long, bitter message about how I had destroyed the family, how Sarah had been brainwashed, how they were being forced to leave their home because of me. I didn't even open it all the way. I shredded it. Sarah didn't ask what it said. A month later, the house was officially sold. We watched as the moving trucks arrived. Box by box, piece by piece, Mark and Linda's things disappeared into the trailers. Then came move-out day. Linda stood by their car, red-eyed and shaking, staring at our house like she was expecting Sarah to come running out, begging them to stay. Mark stood beside her, arms crossed, his cold, silent glare following us as we drove past. Sarah didn't look back. It didn't take long for Linda's last-ditch effort to begin. A week later, I heard from a distant relative that Linda had been calling around, trying to turn the family against us. She told them Sarah had abandoned her parents in their old age, that I had brainwashed her, and that we had moved away without a word. But something had changed. People weren't buying it anymore. Most of the family had already seen how manipulative Mark and Linda were. They were tired of the drama. Some didn't even bother responding to Linda's messages. Others straight up told to stop stirring the pot. The smear campaign fizzled out. Now it was just quiet. For the first time since we got married, Sarah and I had peace. We settled into our new home, a beautiful house in a quiet gated neighborhood, miles away from the nightmare we had escaped. There were no random knocks at the door, no watchful eyes peering through windows, no unexpected emergencies designed to reel Sarah back in. It was exactly what we had wanted all along. Then Linda sent an email. A long, drawn-out guilt trip about how she and Mark were so hurt, but still loved Sarah. No matter what, it went straight to the trash. A few weeks later, we found out what had happened to them through a mutual friend. We learned that after their lease ended, Mark and Linda were forced to downsize. Their grand plan had completely backfired. Instead of living next door to their daughter, they were now in a tiny rental apartment across town, far from the life they had envisioned. They had sold their house thinking they could outlast us. Now they were stuck. Linda still wasn't done embarrassing herself. One day, someone sent me a screenshot of a Facebook rant she posted. A long, dramatic post about toxic daughters-in-law ruining families, about selfish children who forget who raised them, and how some people let their spouses destroy everything good in their lives. It was obvious who she was talking about, but the best part, no one agreed with her. The comment section was a wasteland of awkward silence, and one or two generic prayers for you responses. Not a single person came to her defense. The real kicker came a few months later. Sarah's brother called, mentioning that Mark and Linda had miscalculated their finances. They had used most of their savings to cover closing costs and realtor fees when selling their home, assuming they'd still have financial stability. However, Unexpected maintenance fees, property taxes, and an increased cost of living in their rental drained them faster than they anticipated. Now they were struggling. Sarah's response was instant, "Not my problem." She didn't hesitate. She didn't feel guilty. She didn't second-guess herself. For the first time in her life, she wasn't trapped by obligation. Linda made one last attempt to stay relevant. She started liking Sarah's old Facebook posts, leaving little comments as if nothing had happened. Sarah blocked her. Time passed. Mark and Linda faded into the background. At first, they would still try to reach out every few weeks, then every few months, then nothing. They finally realized it was over. Sarah and I had won. Looking back, it was almost laughable how much time, effort, and manipulation Mark and Linda had poured into controlling Sarah's life. They could have had a normal, healthy relationship with their daughter. Instead, they chose to push, overstep, manipulate, and guilt trip until she had no choice but to walk away for good. Boundaries mean nothing without consequences. You can say no all you want, but unless you enforce it, people like Mark and Linda will keep pushing until they get their way. That's the ultimate lesson we learned. Now we live in complete peace. No more manipulation, no more drama, just us, living our lives on our own terms. Sarah and I sat on the back porch one evening, watching the sunset, glasses of wine in hand. No texts, no calls, no surprises, just silence. The best kind. But even in paradise, the snake can slither back in. A few weeks after the house was sold, we expected to see new owners moving in. Instead, we noticed something odd. Mark and Linda were still coming and going, as if nothing had changed. A neighbor later mentioned they had sold the house to a private investor, then immediately signed a lease to rent it back, ensuring they could stay without technically owning it. It was a premeditated move to maintain control. At first, it was a relief. If it took months for the new owners to move in, fine by me. But Sarah started getting nervous. What if they had sold it to someone they knew? A friend they could manipulate? Or worse, what if they never really sold it at all? I called the real estate agent who handled the sale. Just a casual check-in to see if they knew when the new owners were moving, and the agent got weirdly vague. It was a private sale. They said the buyer preferred anonymity. They couldn't disclose any details. That's when I knew something was wrong. No attic goodbye messages. No "you'll regret this" rant. Just nothing, which made it worse. These were people who thrived on control, who couldn't handle not being in Sarah's life. So why weren't they doing anything, unless they didn't have to? One night, Sarah's phone buzzed a message from her mother. "I hope you're happy you forced us to do this." Sarah stared at it for a long moment, and I grabbed my laptop. It was time to dig. I checked public property records. The sale had gone through, but instead of private buyers, it had been purchased by an LLC linked to a property management firm. My stomach sank. It was a setup from the beginning. They had arranged to sell it, then lease it back quietly. They had never planned to leave. I dug further, checking new lease agreements. Then I saw it. Mark and Linda were still living there. They had rented the house back. They weren't gone. They were never planning to leave. The next morning, Linda was outside watering her plants like nothing happened, smiling, waving at neighbors like she hadn't just pulled off the most manipulative stunt yet. Later that day, she caught Sarah outside with the smugness of a woman who thought she had won. She leaned in and said, "You didn't win. Family is forever." They had played the long game, sold the house, pocketed the money, then rented it back under the radar. They had counted on Sarah breaking down, coming to them in tears, begging them to stay, but she didn't. Now they were just waiting for her to give up. Sarah walked into the house, grabbed her phone, and blocked their numbers. Not just on her phone, on everything. Social media, emails, work contacts. She made it clear there was no coming back from this. Linda tried one last time. She knocked on the door that evening, smiling sweet like nothing had happened, like we were all going to pretend this wasn't completely insane. Sarah didn't answer. Linda left a note on the doorstep. "We'll always be here when you come to your senses." Sarah didn't cry. She didn't hesitate. She walked straight to the shredder and fed the note through. Then she turned to me and said, "Let's talk to a lawyer." I scheduled a meeting the next morning. We laid everything out, the harassment, the privacy violations, the fake emergencies. The lawyer listened carefully. Then they gave us two options: send a formal cease and desist letter, or move. Neither option felt great, but one thing was clear: Mark and Linda weren't going to leave us alone. If we couldn't get them out of our lives, we might have to get out ourselves. And this time, we wouldn't be telling them where we were going. Sarah and I started looking at houses in secret. We didn't tell a single soul, not even friends, because we knew how fast word could spread. If Mark and Linda got even a hint that we were planning to leave, they would try to sabotage it. We visited listings in different neighborhoods, set up alerts, and told the real estate agent that privacy was our top priority. Meanwhile, Linda had shifted tactics. Since she could no longer control Sarah directly, she turned her attention to me. It started small. She would walk through our yard like she had every right to be there. No knocking, no hesitation, just casually strolling past our windows with no explanation. One morning, I caught her peering into our kitchen through the side window before quickly scurrying back to her house. Then came the food deliveries. Twice a week, we'd get random meals sent to our house, takeout orders under Sarah's maiden name. We called the restaurants, and, sure enough, they had all been paid for with cash. Neighbors started asking questions. Linda made sure to give them answers. Mark played the heartbroken father, telling anyone who would listen that we had abandoned them, that Sarah had turned cruel after getting married, that I had isolated her and brainwashed her into cutting off her own family. Then Mark filed another HOA complaint. This time, it was about our security cameras. According to him, they were intrusive and violating privacy, despite the fact that they were clearly facing our own driveway and front door. I hit back. I submitted my own complaint listing every single violation they had committed over the last year: the trespassing, the property damage, the harassment. The HOA started paying attention. Neighbors, tired of the drama, began turning against Mark and Linda. Some openly called them intrusive and manipulative. Others stopped talking to them altogether. Mark initially had strong influence in the HOA, but that began to change when more neighbors started filing complaints about his behavior. Several families came forward about how he had tried to impose unnecessary restrictions. The HOA board, seeing the increased pushback, started distancing themselves from him. Eventually, his attempts to control the neighborhood backfired, leading to their lease being reconsidered. Sarah sent one last message. It was short, direct, no emotion. "We are done. Stop this or you'll regret it." Linda lost it. A day later, Sarah's phone rang. It was another fake emergency. Mark had collapsed. Linda's voice was hysterical. They didn't know what to do. Sarah didn't fall for it. Instead of rushing over, she called Mark's actual doctor. There was no medical emergency. Mark had never even been admitted anywhere. And just like that, they lost their last weapon. For the first time, we weren't reacting anymore. We weren't playing their game. We were fully in control. Then the real estate agent called. A house, perfect location, private gated neighborhood. We put in an offer the same day. It was accepted. Within 48 hours, we were getting out. A few days later, we got even better news. Mark and Linda's lease was not being renewed. They were being forced to move. And then came the ultimate irony. They called Sarah, begging for help. They didn't know where to go. They didn't have a backup plan. Sarah didn't reply. We started packing. For the first time since this nightmare began, we were leaving for good. Moving day arrived sooner than expected. Everything was packed, the moving truck was loaded, and Sarah and I stood in our now empty house, taking one last look around. It was supposed to be our dream home, but it had been anything but. It never truly felt like ours. Not with Mark and Linda lurking next door, pulling their manipulative stunts at every turn. Now we were finally free. As we pulled out of the driveway, Linda was waiting. She stood in her front yard, crying dramatically, dabbing at her eyes like she was mourning a funeral. Mark stood beside her, arms crossed, his cold, silent glare following us as we drove past. Sarah didn't look back. It didn't take long for Linda's last-ditch effort to begin. A week later, I heard from a distant relative that Linda had been calling around, trying to turn the family against us. She told them Sarah had abandoned her parents in their old age, that I had brainwashed her, and that we had moved away without a word. But something had changed. People weren't buying it anymore. Most of the family had already seen how manipulative Mark and Linda were. They were tired of the drama. Some didn't even bother responding to Linda's messages. Others straight up told them to stop stirring the pot. The smear campaign fizzled out. Now it was just quiet. For the first time since we got married, Sarah and I had peace. We settled into our new home, a beautiful house in a quiet, gated neighborhood miles away from the nightmare we had escaped. There were no random knocks at the door, no watchful eyes peering through windows, no unexpected emergencies designed to reel Sarah back in. It was exactly what we had wanted all along. Then Linda sent an email, a long, drawn-out guilt trip about how she and Mark were so hurt, but still loved Sarah no matter what. It went straight to the trash. A few weeks later, we found out what had happened to them through a mutual friend. We learned that after their lease ended, Mark and Linda were forced to downsize. Their grand plan had completely backfired. Instead of living next door to their daughter, they were now in a tiny rental apartment across town, far from the life they had envisioned. They had sold their house thinking they could outlast us. Now they were stuck. Linda still wasn't done embarrassing herself. One day, someone sent me a screenshot of a Facebook rant she posted. A long, dramatic post about toxic daughters-in-law, ruining families, about selfish children who forget who raised them, and how some people let their spouses destroy everything good in their lives. It was obvious who she was talking about, but the best part, no one agreed with her. The comment section was a wasteland of awkward silence, and one or two generic prayers for you responses. Not a single person came to her defense. The real kicker came a few months later. Sarah's brother called, mentioning that Mark and Linda had miscalculated their finances. They had used most of their savings to cover closing costs and realtor fees when selling their home, assuming they'd still have financial stability. However, unexpected maintenance fees, property taxes, and an increased cost of living in their rental drained them faster than they anticipated. Now they were struggling. Sarah's response was instant. Not my problem. She didn't hesitate. She didn't feel guilty. She didn't second-guess herself. For the first time in her life, she wasn't trapped by obligation. Linda made one last attempt to stay relevant. She started liking Sarah's old Facebook posts, leaving little comments as if nothing had happened. Sarah blocked her. Time passed. Mark and Linda faded into the background. At first, they would still try to reach out every few weeks, then every few months, then nothing. They finally realized it was over. Sarah and I had won. Looking back, it was almost laughable how much time, effort, and manipulation Mark and Linda had poured into controlling Sarah's life. They could have had a normal, healthy relationship with their daughter. Instead, they chose to push, overstep, manipulate, and guilt trip until she had no choice but to walk away for good. Boundaries mean nothing without consequences. You can say no all you want, but unless you enforce it, people like Mark and Linda will keep pushing, and until they get their way. That's the ultimate lesson we learned. Now we live in complete peace. No more manipulation, no more drama, just us living our lives on our own terms. Sarah and I sat on the back porch one evening, watching the sunset, glasses of wine in hand. No texts, no calls, no surprises, just silence, the best kind. After everything, it was finally over. And in the eerie, peaceful silence of our victory, I finally understood what true freedom meant. Not just escaping the clutches of Mark and Linda, but freeing Sarah and myself from the invisible chains of obligation and guilt. We had a life to build, a future to create, and this time, it was ours. The end.